The kingdom of Yulondo was a land of abundance, its fields golden with ripe harvest and its rivers teeming with life. Its people were strong and joyful, for they lived under the rule of a wise and just king. King Maduka, though aging, had spent his years governing with fairness and wisdom. His queen, Adana, was as beautiful as she was proud, and her vanity had only grown with time. But nothing in the kingdom was more revered than their daughter, Princess Ezima. She was a vision of perfection, her skin glowed like polished mahogany, her eyes sparkled like the morning sun on a clear river, and her voice was as melodious as a nightingale's song. Yet, behind that beauty lay a heart as cold as the mountain peaks. Ezima had inherited her mother's pride, but unlike Queen Adana, who masked hers with charm, the princess made no effort to hide her arrogance. She sneered at the palace servants, mocked the common folk, and, worst of all, humiliated the suitors who came from distant lands, hoping to win her hand. Wealthy princes arrived bearing gifts of gold and silk, but she turned up her nose. Mighty warriors, draped in leopard skins, offered their strength, but she laughed at their scars. Scholars recited poetry woven with the stars, yet she yawned in boredom. Her demands were impossible. I shall only marry a man who is as handsome as the rising sun, stronger than 1,000 lions, richer than the earth itself, and wiser than the gods, she declared before the royal court, her voice ringing with scorn. The people whispered among themselves. The king sighed, for he knew the gods watched all things, and pride had consequences. Then, Yulondo began to change. The rains, once plentiful, became scarce. The crops, once bountiful, grew weak. The hunters returned with empty hands, and the merchants spoke of strange misfortunes. Whispers filled the air, was the princess's arrogance angering the gods? Still, Ezima did not waver. Then came the festival of Ek, the grandest celebration in the land. The kingdom gathered in the palace square, where dancers moved like the wind, and drums thundered like distant storms. It was on this night that the princess, draped in the finest silks, stood before the people and declared once more, I will only marry a man who is flawless in beauty, might, wisdom, and wealth. No such man exists, and so I shall remain unmatched above all others. The crowd murmured in unease. The elders shook their heads. The king lowered his gaze. But somewhere, beyond the firelight and laughter, something listened. Something ancient. Something unseen. And it smiled. 3 days after the festival, a hush fell over the kingdom as a stranger arrived at the gates of Yulondo. He was unlike any man the people had ever seen. Standing at an impossible 7 feet tall, his golden skin shimmered like the morning sun. His garments, woven with threads of silver and sapphire, seemed to dance with light. His eyes, deep, endless, and filled with mysteries, held the gaze of all who dared look into them. He rode upon a horse as black as the night sky, its hooves never once touching the ground as it moved. Behind him followed an entourage of silent, shadowy figures carrying chests so heavy they made the earth tremble with each step. The stranger strode into the palace courtyard, where King Maduka and Queen Adana sat upon their thrones, with Princess Ezima reclining beside them in sheer boredom. The moment her gaze fell upon him, however, her disinterest vanished. I am Obiora, the stranger announced, his voice smooth and rich, like a river flowing over polished stones. I have traveled from lands beyond the mountains, from a kingdom unknown to your maps, to claim the hand of the most beautiful woman in Yulondo. Gasps rippled through the court. Ezima's lips parted in wonder. Never had she seen a man so perfect, so magnificent that he seemed carved from the very dreams of the gods. The suitors before him had been but dust compared to his brilliance. The stranger smiled knowingly, then raised his hand. His shadowy attendants stepped forward, unlocking the chest they carried. Jewels the size of a child's fist spilled forth, dazzling in the torchlight. Silk softer than a lover's touch unfolded in cascades of color. Strange fruits, glowing faintly as if kissed by the stars themselves, filled the air with their intoxicating scent. The queen gasped in delight, rising from her throne. By the gods! This is wealth unlike any we have ever seen. The people, the nobles, the court, they all murmured in awe. King Maduka, however, remained silent. His wise eyes, honed by years of rule, narrowed slightly. There was something unnatural about this man, something unseen but deeply felt. But before he could speak, Ezima took a step forward, her voice breathless with excitement. And do you possess wisdom, strength, and beauty beyond all men, as I have demanded? Obiora smiled, and in that moment, the torches flickered as if the very air had bowed to his presence. Princess, he said smoothly, do I not stand before you? Ezima shivered. It was a thrilling kind of fear, like standing at the edge of a great height, staring into the endless sky. The queen, entranced by Obiora's magnificence and wealth, clasped her hands together. This is fate. A man who meets every desire of our daughter. A match blessed by the heavens. The king exhaled slowly, looking to his daughter. And what say you, Ezima? Ezima turned back to Obiora, her heart pounding. For the first time in her life, she was at a loss for words. She had never imagined she would find a man who could match her impossible expectations. I will go with him, she declared, her voice trembling with excitement. The people erupted into cheers, the queen beamed with triumph, and the kingdom prepared for the grandest wedding Yulondo had ever seen. Yet as the celebrations stretched long into the night, King Maduka sat in silence, his unease growing. For he knew that nothing in this world was truly perfect. And perfection, when it appeared, always came with a price. The day of departure arrived with great fanfare. The streets of Yulondo overflowed with cheering crowds as Princess Ezima, draped in the finest silks, climbed atop Obiora's midnight black steed. The queen smiled in pride, the king watched in silence, and the people marveled at the man who had won the heart of their most unreachable princess. Obiora led the way, his golden skin gleaming under the morning sun, his mysterious aura only deepening as they ventured beyond the borders of Yulondo. 3 of his attendants followed closely behind, silent, faceless figures draped in flowing veils. They neither spoke nor ate, and their presence sent a chill through the air. Ezima, intoxicated by her own fortune, paid them no mind. She basked in the thought of her new life, convinced that she had made the perfect choice. But as the journey continued, small oddities began to surface. By midday, they reached the Whispering River, a place known for the way its waters murmured secrets when the wind passed through. The horses slowed as they approached the wooden bridge spanning the rushing current. Then, without warning, one of the veiled attendants stopped. A faint whisper escaped from beneath the cloth covering his face. Here is where I rest. Before Ezima could react, the figure stepped forward and dissolved into the water, vanishing beneath the surface without so much as a ripple. She blinked in confusion. What just happened? Obiora did not turn back. Nothing to concern yourself with, he said smoothly, guiding his horse forward. Some are meant to travel only so far. Ezima hesitated but quickly dismissed the unease curling in her chest. Perhaps it is their custom, she thought, lifting her chin. She laughed lightly, tossing her braids over her shoulder. I will miss Yulondo, but I am certain my new kingdom will be grander in every way. No one replied. As dusk approached, the path darkened, leading them into a dense and eerie forest. The towering trees blocked out the sky, their twisted branches clawing toward the earth like grasping hands. The air grew thick, damp with the scent of moss and something else, something old. Ezima wrapped her arms around herself. This place is unsettling. Obiora remained silent, his golden skin now seeming dull in the fading light. Then, the second veiled attendant stopped. He reached down, grasped his legs, and removed them as if shedding a pair of boots. The limbs turned to dust, scattering into the forest floor. The voice beneath the veil was barely audible. I no longer need this where I go. With that, it drifted into the shadows, disappearing among the trees. Ezima's breath hitched. Her heart pounded as she looked from Obiora to the remaining attendant. Did you see that? She demanded. Obiora did not break stride. Some burdens must be left behind, he said simply. Ezima swallowed hard. A cold sensation began creeping up her spine. No, she told herself. This is a test. A challenge before my new life begins. Still, the laughter that had once bubbled so easily in her throat was gone. For the first time, a whisper of doubt touched her heart. And the journey was far from over, the horrifying truth of Obiora. Night had fallen by the time they emerged from the forest, and the world around them had changed. Gone were the rolling green hills and the golden sunsets of Ilondo. Instead, they entered a land devoid of life, dry, cracked earth stretched endlessly, and the wind howled like a grieving spirit. No stars shone above, only an eerie, shifting mist that hung low, curling around their feet like ghostly fingers. Ezima's breath came in shallow gasps. Where are we? Obiora did not answer. The last of his silent companions stepped forward. With a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his hands, then twisted them off like they were nothing more than gloves. Ezima's stomach lurched as the limbs crumbled into ash, drifting away on the wind. The veiled figure's voice was no louder than a whisper. I am no longer needed. And with that, he vanished into the shadows, leaving only silence behind. Ezima gripped the reins of her horse, her fingers trembling. Obiora, she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. What is happening? For the first time since their journey began, Obiora turned to face her. And he smiled. The change was subtle at first, his golden skin lost its luster, darkening like metal left to rust. His regal robes, once shimmering with silver and sapphire, dulled into ragged, tattered cloth. Then his face, began to stretch and distort. His sharp jaw elongated unnaturally, his once perfect features melting like wax. His nose disappeared, his eyes darkened, sinking deep into his skull until they became two hollow, endless voids. Ezima could not breathe. Her body screamed at her to move, to run, to do anything but sit frozen as the being before her shed its human disguise. A voice, deep, ancient, and layered with echoes, rose from Obiora's twisted form. Did you think perfection came without a price? Ezima opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. Obiora, or whatever he had once been, drifted closer. His body no longer had weight, no longer obeyed the laws of men. I borrowed my beauty from the dead, he whispered, his voice curling around her ears like a serpent. I stolen from a prince who drowned in sorrow. Skin from a warrior burned by betrayal. Strength from a giant who fell to greed. Every piece, taken, worn, shaped, to be what you desired. He leaned closer, the empty holes where his eyes had once been mere inches from her face. And now, beloved princess, you are mine. Ezima's scream finally tore from her throat. She kicked her horse, trying to flee, but the beast would not move. The mist thickened, twisting around her like living vines. She turned in every direction, but there was no escape. The air had changed. The ground beneath her had changed. This was no longer the world she knew. She was trapped. Trapped in the spirit world. And there was no way back. Ezima could barely breathe. The air around her was thick, pressing down on her like an unseen weight. The mist swirled at her feet, rising like hungry tendrils, whispering in voices she could not understand. Obiora loomed over her, his hollow eyes gleaming with unnatural hunger. He reached for her, his elongated fingers curling like the claws of a beast. Come, my bride. It is time. Ezima shook her head violently. No. I do not belong to you. But Obiora only laughed, his voice layered and distorted, as if 100 whispers spoke at once. You wished for a perfect husband, and so I became one. Now, you are mine. Ezima tried to run, but the mist thickened, curling around her ankles, pulling her toward the abyss beyond. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and for the first time in her life, she knew true fear. Then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. Not so fast, spirit. A small figure stepped forward, emerging from the swirling darkness. He was no taller than Ezima's waist, a stout, dwarf-like man with deep brown skin and a long, tangled beard. His eyes, sharp and knowing, twinkled with an otherworldly glow. He wore simple robes, but in his hand, he carried a staff that pulsed with a soft, golden light. Obiora hissed, stepping back. Kolu, is part. Ezima clung to the sight of the stranger like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. Please. Help me, she cried. The little man, Kolu, stroked his beard. A foolish child, he muttered, shaking his head. You ignored the warnings. You walked willingly into the jaws of the beast. And now you beg for help? Ezima's lip trembled. I didn't know. Kolu's sharp gaze pinned her in place. Didn't you? Or did you refuse to see? Before she could answer, Obiora lunged. His shadowy form stretched, his fingers elongating like vines reaching for Kolu's throat. But the dwarf was ready. With a swift movement, Kolu slammed his staff into the ground. A burst of golden light erupted from the earth, forcing Obiora back with a screech. The mist around them recoiled, clearing enough for Ezima to see the cracked ground beneath her feet. You dare interfere? Obiora snarled, his voice shaking the very air. I dare, Kolu said simply. The battle unlike anything Ezima had ever seen unfolded before her eyes. Obiora twisted and writhed, his form shifting from one terrifying shape to another, first a towering specter, then a monstrous bird, then a clawed beast with fangs that dripped black mist. He lashed out, sending waves of dark energy toward Kolu. But the little man stood firm, deflecting each attack with the swift movements of his glowing staff. He spun, struck, and summoned golden barriers of light, each one pushing Obiora further back. Ezima, still frozen in fear, watched as the battle raged. Every time Obiora attacked, Kolu countered. The spirit's frustration grew, his form flickering, unstable. This one belongs to me. Obiora roared, his voice shaking the very ground. She chose me. Her own greed led her here. Ezima flinched at his words. Kolu frowned and turned to her. Tell me, princess, he said, blocking another strike with his staff. Do you regret the choices that led you here? Tears welled in Ezima's eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt truly small. Truly ashamed. She thought of the suitors she had mocked. The servants she had scorned. The people of Yulondo who whispered of her cruelty while she laughed in their faces. She thought of the impossible standards she had set, the way she had humiliated those who did not meet them. And now, she was the fool. I was wrong, she whispered. Then louder, I was wrong. I was proud. I was cruel. I thought I deserved the perfect man, but I never thought about the price. Please, please help me. Kolu gave a slow nod. But Obiora screeched in fury. No. She is mine. Her soul belongs to me. Kolu lifted his staff high. Ancestors, hear me, he called. The air vibrated with power. From the swirling mist, shadowy figures began to emerge, tall, regal spirits with wise, glowing eyes. They did not speak, but their presence alone made Obiora's form flicker violently. No. Obiora shrieked as the spirits stretched out their hands. His golden skin cracked, his face twisted in agony. She belongs to me. You have no power over a willing heart, one of the spirits whispered. Obiora screamed as his form shattered into nothingness, swallowed by the mist. The air stilled. The ground beneath Ezima solidified. The weight in her chest lifted. She gasped, falling to her knees. Kolu tapped his staff on the ground, and the last of the mist faded. He turned to Ezima. "You are not free yet, princess." Ezima blinked. "What do you mean?" Kolu studied her carefully. "Obiora was a reflection of your own heart, a thing of greed and vanity. To truly be free, you must prove that your heart has changed." Ezima swallowed hard. "How?" Kolu's eyes darkened. "You must do one selfless act. Not for yourself. Not for glory. But because it is right." Ezima felt her breath quicken. For the first time, her fate was in her own hands. And she had no idea if she could prove herself worthy. Ezima stood at the edge of the spirit world, her heart pounding in her chest. The eerie mist had faded, and before her stretched a long, winding road leading back to the mortal realm. Kolu, the small yet powerful guardian, stood beside her, leaning on his glowing staff. "You have been given a second chance," Kolu said, his voice calm yet firm. "But you are not free until you prove you have truly changed. A selfless act, princess. That is the price of your return." Ezima nodded solemnly. Gone was the arrogant girl who had laughed at suitors and scorned kindness. She had seen the price of her pride, and she would not take this opportunity lightly. Together, they stepped onto the road, leaving behind the cold, empty land of spirits. A test of the heart. The journey back was long, stretching across strange landscapes that were neither entirely of the spirit world nor fully of the mortal one. The skies were grey, the trees twisted, and the air carried the whispers of unseen watchers. Ezima barely spoke, lost in thought. How can I prove that I have changed? They walked for hours until they came upon a withered path leading to a small, crumbling hut. Outside, hunched over a pile of firewood, was an old woman. Her back was bent with age, her clothes torn and ragged, and her hands trembled as she struggled to lift the wood. Ezima paused. In her old life, she would have ignored the woman, or worse, mocked her weakness. But now, something in her heart stirred. She approached hesitantly. "Let me help you," she said, kneeling down. The old woman looked up in surprise. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, her eyes clouded with age. "A princess, carrying firewood," she croaked. "The world must be ending." Ezima smiled faintly and, without hesitation, gathered the wood in her arms. It was heavier than she had expected, but she carried it inside the hut. The interior was bare, with only a straw mat and a single clay pot filled with water. "Do you live alone?" Ezima asked gently. The woman sighed. "My children are gone. My village has forgotten me. I have only my hands to keep me warm, but they grow weaker by the day." A lump formed in Ezima's throat. She could not imagine such loneliness. She thought of all the times she had turned her back on those in need, believing herself too important to care. She glanced at Kolu, who watched silently. Then, without another word, Ezima knelt beside the fire and began to prepare a meal using what little the old woman had. She boiled water, crushed dried herbs, and softened a handful of millet. When the food was ready, she offered the first bowl to the woman. Tears welled in the old woman's eyes. "No one has done this for me in years." Ezima smiled softly. "Then let this be the first of many times." The woman grasped her hands. "May the ancestors bless you, child." At that moment, the air around them shimmered. The whispers in the wind grew silent, and a soft warmth filled the hut. Kolu stepped forward, his staff glowing brightly. "The spirits have seen your kindness, princess. The curse is broken." Ezima gasped. A golden light surrounded her, lifting her gently off the ground. She felt lighter, freer, as if a great weight had been lifted from her soul. Then, the world around them shifted. They returned to Yulondo. Ezima opened her eyes to find herself standing at the gates of Yulondo. The warm sun kissed her skin, and the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers filled the air. She had made it home. The guards at the palace entrance froze in shock before rushing inside. Within moments, a cry of joy echoed through the halls. Princess Ezima has returned. The doors of the royal court burst open, and King Maduka came running. His strong, aged face was lined with exhaustion, but when his eyes fell upon his daughter, they filled with tears. "My child," he whispered, before pulling her into a fierce embrace. "I feared I had lost you forever." Ezima clung to him, her tears soaking into his robe. "Father, I was foolish. I was blind to my own heart. But I have learned. I will be better." The king pulled back, studying her with a knowing gaze. "I see it in your eyes," he said. "You are not the same girl who left this kingdom." Queen Adana, however, remained frozen in place. "But, what of your husband?" she asked hesitantly. Ezima turned to her mother. "He was a lie, a trick born from my own arrogance. He was never real." The queen's face paled. She opened her mouth to protest, but Ezima stepped forward. "Mother, I do not wish to be like you." Gasps rippled through the court. Queen Adana flinched. "What do you mean?" Ezima's voice was steady. "For years, I followed your example, believing that beauty and power were everything. But I was wrong. True nobility is found in the heart, in kindness, in wisdom. I will not be a queen who rules with vanity. I will be one who serves her people." The queen lowered her gaze, speechless. And for the first time, Ezima felt truly free. A love born of respect. In the months that followed, Yulondo flourished. The kingdom rejoiced in the return of their princess, but they soon saw that she was no longer the girl they had once feared. She visited the villages, listened to the people's needs, and worked to mend the wounds she had caused. Where once she had laughed at suffering, now she fought to ease it. And by her side, always, was Kolu. At first, he stayed only as a guide, ensuring she remained on her path. But over time, Ezima found herself drawn to his quiet strength, his wisdom, and the way he challenged her to be better. One evening, as they walked through the royal gardens, Ezima turned to him. "You saved me, Kolu. More than once." The little man smirked. "And you finally listened. That is the real miracle." Ezima laughed, a sound warm and genuine. She knelt before him, lowering herself to his height. "Would you stay, Kolu? Not as my guardian, but as my husband." Kolu blinked in surprise, then chuckled. "You would marry a simple guardian." Ezima smiled. "You are more noble than any prince I have ever met." The wedding was unlike any Yulondo had ever seen. It was not grand because of wealth, but because of joy. The people celebrated a princess who had been lost but found her way home. And so, under the golden sky, Ezima and Kolu were wed. The kingdom flourished under their rule, proving that even the proudest hearts can change. And that true love is not found in riches or beauty, but in kindness, humility, and the willingness to grow. And so, the legend of the proud princess who became the wise queen was told for generations to come. The end.